I just wonder, you've bravely been answering the latest problems for the government this morning. But when you were sent out, did you know this was going to happen, that Nadim Zahawi was going to be fired?
No, I knew that the independent advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, had been asked by the Prime Minister to look into these affairs. And in fact, I heard when I woke up on Times Radio this morning, Chloe and Callum on breakfast, quoting from Tim Shipman, and Tim, always a well-informed correspondent, suggested that the report might be imminent. And then, of course, the letter from Sir Laurie was released just before I appeared on Laura Kuenssberg's programme. And the letter, of course, reflected Sir Laurie's rigorous investigation into Nadim's position with respect to the ministerial code. And then I think almost immediately upon receipt of the letter and having a chance to read it, the Prime Minister decided that sadly, but clearly, Nadim had to go.
You didn't feel a bit that you'd been caught on the hop? I mean, after all, you work for Downing Street. One might have thought they could get around to telling you.
No, I don't feel at all. I think that, as ever, there's an integrity to this process. So, the first thing to say is that the Prime Minister wanted to make sure the facts were assessed by an independent, impartial person in full. And then once he had had a chance to look at the material, he was then able to form that judgment. And of course, it was just as I was appearing on Laura Kuenssberg's programme that matters were made clear. And again, I think it's absolutely right that, firstly, the investigation should have been conducted rigorously. That takes a little bit of time, but it was done as quickly as possible. And then secondly, once presented with the consequences of the investigation, the Prime Minister acted clearly and firmly.
I mean, the Prime Minister says in his letter, when I became Prime Minister last year, I pledged the government I would lead would have integrity, professionalism and accountability. It is clear that there's been a serious breach of the ministerial code. And as a result, I've informed you of my decision to remove you from your position in Her Majesty's government. What do you say to those who say he should have acted a lot earlier, and indeed that previous Prime Ministers should have known about Mr. Zahawi's tax situation?
Well, I think integrity and professionalism are there in the process which the Prime Minister put in place. So the first thing about integrity is that you don't and shouldn't condemn someone just on the basis of press reporting. Of course, there will be valid investigative journalism that will bring certain things to light, but when they are brought to light, then government has a responsibility to make sure that the facts are assembled as clearly and comprehensively as possible, because you've got to give someone a presumption of innocence until the facts say otherwise. That is integrity. And professionalism is making sure that even as you're dealing with these situations, that you concentrate on the job in hand. Professionalism means that we concentrate on halving inflation, on reducing debt, on growing the economy, and on the other priorities the public have for us, including cutting waiting lists and stopping the boats on the channel.
I should say we're very anxious to talk to you about what you've got to say in your area of responsibility, particularly in the wake of the Grenfell inquiry. But before we go on, I do just want to ask you what your feelings are about Mr. Zahawi, who, according to the evidence produced by Sir Laurie Magnus, had repeated opportunities where he should have come clean on his affairs, and he didn't, instead of which he attacked news stories as inaccurate, unfair and smears when they've turned out to be true. What do you think of Mr. Zahawi?
Well, I'm sad. He's a friend. I worked with Nadim during the COVID pandemic when he led the vaccine rollout. He did a great job then. And
he's not a person of integrity, though, is he?
And all of us are flawed, Adam. All of us are. All of us have dreadful, faults and weaknesses and so on. So, I'm not going to judge Nadim. No, of course not. I'm sorry that this has happened.
Mr. Gove, I suppose you're in a slightly difficult position here this morning. You're forced to be in a position to defend something. I don't know whether or not you've read the full report that's come out this morning. It is 4 pages long. But there's a difference between making a mistake and actually doing something deliberately. And this report sets out the multiple occasions when Mr. Zahawi had the opportunity and was expected to declare that he was not just in dispute with HMRC, but that also he had been fined, and he didn't do that. In fact,
Yes.
what it seems from this report that he has sought to find excuses for reasons why he didn't feel he should do that, not only leaving his Prime Minister in a position where Rishi Sunak was unaware, but others in senior positions in government were unaware too. And it seems to have been done deliberately on reading of this report.
Yeah, you're right. Sir Laurie's letter goes into a significant amount of detail, and the conclusions are pretty clear. And the Prime Minister's acted on that, and Nadim has accepted that. Again, perfectly legitimately, you're inviting me to pass judgment. I'm not the person who should be passing judgment. I'm not the commentator or the ethics reviewer here. They've done their work.
It must be pretty frustrating, though, as a senior member of the government, to be on a programme this morning when you want to talk about housing. You probably also want to talk about the NHS, and yet you're repeatedly being questioned about the conduct of a colleague, which seems to have been deliberate.
Well, I'm not going to criticise you for following up an important news story. My responsibility is to get on in government with delivery. Of course, you have a journalistic imperative, which I respect, to ask that. And again, I completely understand that there'll be a range of views that people will have about this issue. They will ventilate during the course of the day. People will draw conclusions, all legitimate. They are commentators. I'm a minister. My job is to concentrate on delivering positive change, and whether that is in housing or whether that's contributing to the government drive to reduce inflation and to generate broader economic growth, that is my role.
Well, it's interesting that you defend the right of the press to follow stories like this, because in his letter to the Prime Minister, Nadim Zahawi has called out the behaviour of what he calls the Fourth Estate, the media. He says he's concerned about the conduct of some in the Fourth Estate in recent weeks. He's referring to a particular headline, which he says has had an impact on his family. But do you think he's right to criticise the press for trying to report what ultimately has resulted in his resignation and therefore was an important story?
Well, I'm a believer, free speech goes two ways. So I'm a strong believer in free speech, strong believer in the right of the media to not just hold politicians to account, but to ask difficult questions, to investigate and expose wrongdoing. But I think it's also the case in political debate that politicians and other public actors do have the freedom from time to time to be able to push back and to argue that the way in which stories are written or headlines are written isn't right. That is part of debate, part of the whole program of free speech in a vigorous, open democracy. Everyone should have the right to express their views.
Yeah, but isn't it nitpicking about the fundamentals, really? Oh yeah, I've been caught doing something wrong, but actually I blame people for exposing it. I mean,
I don't think he's doing that. I've just before I appeared on your show, I read the letter that Nadim had written. I don't think he's doing that. I don't think he's criticising the investigation. He is, and again, he's raising an issue about a particular way in which a particular article was framed and the impact on people he loves and those close to him. And again, I don't want to get drawn. Of course, you must ask, but I don't want to get drawn into attributing, points on either side of the board in this argument. That it's 2-1 to the media or 3-1 to politicians or so on. My role, insofar as I can every day, is to try to drive positive change to get a better deal for the people who look to government. And that happens against a backdrop of vigorous public debate, and quite right too.
There are two questions which follow. Well, there are probably many more, actually, but the immediate questions are, should Nadim Zahawi resign as an MP? And also, given that Dominic Raab is being investigated over bullying allegations, can we expect the Prime Minister to take the results of that investigation, whatever they may be, as seriously? And would you now like to see that investigation sped up or the results of that come quickly?
On the first, I don't think Nadim should resign as an MP, absolutely not. On the second, I think that everyone would want that investigation to be concluded in as timely and rapid a way as possible. But again, the important thing is to make sure that it's done rigorously.